Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into what weddings were like in medieval times and how people gathered in Greek drinking rooms, preparing beauty along rituals the Nile, and struggling to build community in the early settlement of Jamestown, letting old times unfold at a pace meant for rest. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. Tonight, you are not moving through a battlefield or a palace hall. Instead, you're stepping into smaller places where history was quietly shaped, a muddy village path where news travels by whisper, a lamplit room where wine is carefully mixed with water, a polished bronze mirror beside a jar of dark eye paint, and a wooden shoreline where strangers try to build a home in unfamiliar air. These are not the grand moments that fill monuments. They are the ordinary rituals that teach people how to live beside one another. And so the day begins in a village where no parchment invitations are written, and yet everyone already knows that something important is about to happen. In the early morning, before the sun has fully lifted above the damp roof of the village, you already know there will be a wedding today. No messenger knocked at your door. No ribbon was tied to a gatepost. No written notice arrived folded in careful ink. The news reaches you the way most important things do here, through footsteps, through shared work, through voices that travel along hedges and across fields as naturally as wind over barley. Someone mentioned it yesterday while carrying water from the stream. Someone else repeats it while turning soil beside the cabbage rows. By evening, even the children chasing geese near the path were talking about it as if they had always known. In a place like this, a wedding does not begin with paper. It begins with attention. You step outside into air that still holds the coolness of night. The ground beneath your shoes is soft from recent rain, and somewhere nearby a wooden bucket knocks gently against a well frame as someone begins their morning work earlier than usual. Weddings do not pause the rhythm of labor, they simply weave themselves into it. Across the narrow path, Thomas the ditch farmer is already awake. He kneels beside a split wooden bucket, pressing a strip of damp leather around its rim so it will hold together for another season. He works slowly, not because the task is difficult, but because there is no reason to hurry. The wedding will not begin for several hours yet, and in a village like this, time stretches gently when shared by everyone at once. He glanced up as you passed, nodding once, as if to confirm something neither of you needs to say aloud. Yes, today is the day. In larger towns, people sometimes announce weddings with bells or written notices, but here, voices are enough. A neighbor's memory is more reliable than ink and far easier to carry. You may not even remember when you first heard about this marriage. Perhaps it was weeks ago when the couple began working side by side more often than before. Perhaps it was months earlier when their families started exchanging small visits at the edge of fields, or perhaps the village understood long before the couple themselves did. In places where everyone depends on one another through winter and harvest alike, nothing important remains private for very long. This is partly curiosity, of course, but it is also responsibility. A marriage here is not just about two people. It is about who will share bread ovens, who will inherit tools, who will help repair fences after storms, and who will stand beside whom when sickness comes quietly through the colder months. The household that forms today will change the shape of the village in small but lasting ways. That is why everyone listens when news begins to move. Somewhere farther down the path, you can smell rye bread baking earlier than usual. Weddings often begin with ovens warming before sunrise because feeding a gathering requires patience. Smoke drifts slowly through the still air, carrying the soft scent of grain and ash across the open yard. Someone laughs nearby, and the sound carries easily in the morning calm. Already people are adjusting their work around what is coming. Children have been told they may wander more freely today. Older neighbors are planning which benches to bring closer to the doorway where the vows will be spoken. Someone has offered a clay jug of ale. Someone else has promised onions. None of this is written down. nothing needs to be. In a village like this, preparation moves quietly, like clouds gathering before gentle rain. You begin to notice small signs everywhere. A borrowed cloak hanging from a peg beside a doorway. A ribbon tied loosely around a wooden spoon. A pair of boots brushed more carefully than usual. None of these things announce themselves loudly, yet together they form a pattern that everyone understands. This is how invitations travel here. Not by letter, but by recognition. Long before any priest arrives, long before any vows are spoken, the village itself has already accepted that something is changing. Two separate lives are slowly becoming one household, and everyone nearby is adjusting their expectations in response. Even the animals seem to sense the difference. Chickens scatter more noisily than usual as children chase them away from the open yard. A dog circles twice before settling near the doorway where guests will later gather. Somewhere behind a fence, a cow shifts its weight, its slow breathing steady as always, unimpressed by human ceremony. You might think such a wedding begins at the moment vows are spoken, but in truth, it begins here, in shared glances, borrowed tools, early ovens, and quiet agreement spreading from one doorstep to another. And before long, the bride herself will step into the open morning air, and the entire village will be watching in a silence that feels almost like weather gathering before rain. The morning moves slowly forward, and with it, the feeling of the wedding becomes easier to see. It is not announced by trumpets or banners. Instead, it appears in small changes. A cloak brushed more carefully than usual, a ribbon tied where no ribbon was tied yesterday, a loaf of bread carried across the lane without being asked for payment. These are the signals that something shared is about to happen. You step closer to the edge of the village ovens, where the air has already begun to warm. The ovens belong to everyone. No single household can build one large enough alone, and so they are used in turn, each family waiting patiently for its moment to bake. On ordinary mornings, the smoke rises slowly and without haste, but today, it rises earlier, thicker, and with a certain expectation that seems to settle gently over the yard. Anna, the baker's daughter, is already awake and working beside her mother. Her sleeves are rolled high, dusted with flour from wrist to elbow. She presses a round of rye dough flat against the wooden board, then folds it again with steady, practiced movements that she has learned over many seasons. The dough is heavier than usual today. More grain has been added because more mouths will be eating. She does not look surprised to see you nearby. Weddings always draw people toward the ovens, even before the ceremony begins. Bread must come first. In a village like this, food is not decorated, it is reassurance. A wedding feast does not need sweetness or rare spices. It needs warmth and enough fullness to remind everyone that the new household will not begin alone. The smell of baking grains settles around you like a quiet promise. Someone nearby lifts the lid of a clay pot where onions have already begun to soften in water. Another neighbor arrives carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth, cheese saved carefully through the colder months. None of these gifts are large, none of them are meant to impress, but together they form something stronger than display. They form support. In later centuries, weddings may become places of fine fabric and shining jewelry. But here, clothing tells a simpler story. The garments you see around you this morning are not new. They cannot be. Cloth takes too long to spin, too long to weave, and too long to dye for anyone to prepare an entirely fresh outfit for a single day. Instead, people bring out what they already own at its very best. A wool cloak brushed free of last season's straw. A belt polished with oil until the leather darkens slightly. A ribbon saved from a previous celebration and tied again at the shoulder. Anna herself wears a dress that has been adjusted twice as she has grown taller over the years. The stitching at the hem shows where it was lengthened once, then again. Today, it has been cleaned as carefully as possible, although a faint scent of smoke from winter evenings still clings to the fabric. In truth, this may be the finest garment she owns, and that is enough. You begin to notice how everyone has done something similar. Boots wipe clean against damp grass, sleeves brushed smooth with the flat of a hand, hair tied back more carefully than usual. The effort is quiet, but it is everywhere. Clothing here does not create status, it creates readiness. A wedding is not meant to make anyone look different from who they are. It was meant to show that they are prepared to stand beside one another in public agreement. Nearby, children run freely between the ovens and the open yard. No one calls them back. No one worries that they will disturb the preparations. Weddings are one of the few days when movement is allowed to become a little less careful. Even the smallest members of the village seem to understand that something gentle and important is taking shape. One boy pauses long enough to peer into the oven's open mouth before being gently turned away by Anna's mother, who laughs as she guides him back toward the path. There will be enough bread later. As the morning continues, more small offerings arrive: a wooden spoon carved during the winter months, a handful of dried herbs wrapped in linen, a small jug of ale carried carefully with both hands so it does not spill before its time. None of these gifts are meant to decorate the ceremony. They are meant to sustain the household that will begin today. A spoon can last for years. Herbs can flavor many meals. Ale can welcome visitors who arrive after sunset. Each object carries a future inside it. You begin to understand that preparation for a wedding is not only about the couple. It is about everyone who expects to share their lives with them afterward. The ovens glow more brightly now, and the bread inside them has begun to darken at the edges. When Anna lifts one loaf from the heat with a wooden paddle, steam escapes into the cool air and disappears almost at once. For a moment, the entire yard smells like grain and warmth. She smiles, though she says nothing, and sets the loaf beside the others already cooling on a rough wooden board. There will be many more before the morning ends. It is easy to imagine that a wedding begins when voices are raised in vows. But here, it begins earlier than that, in flour on sleeves, in borrowed ribbons, in boots wiped clean against damp grass, and in bread placed carefully where everyone can reach it. And before long, the couple themselves will step toward the doorway of the church, where only a few quiet words will be needed to change how the entire village understands them. By the time the bread has cooled and the smoke from the ovens begins to thin into the late morning air, the village has already gathered near the church. The building itself is smaller than visitors might expect. Its stone walls are rough, not polished. Its doorway is narrow enough that two people entering side by side must turn slightly toward one another without meaning to. Yet this doorway is where something important is about to happen, not inside the church, at the threshold. You take your place among the others standing in the open yard. No one pushes forward. No one spoke loudly. The quiet here is not silent exactly. It is attention. Everyone understands that what will be said in a few moments does not belong only to the couple. It belongs to the village as well. In many medieval communities, a marriage does not begin with a long ceremony beneath painted ceilings. It begins with words spoken aloud where everyone can hear them. The doorway makes this possible. Inside the church is a sacred space meant for prayer and blessing. But the doorway stands between the sacred and the ordinary world, and so it becomes the place where a household first takes shape. Anyone passing along the path can witness what happens here. Nothing is hidden. This openness is important because a marriage is not just a promise between two people. It is also an agreement recognized by everyone who will live beside them afterwards. The couple arrived quietly. You may have seen them walking together before, carrying tools, sharing work, crossing fields in the same direction at the end of a long day. But today they walked differently. Not more slowly, not more carefully, just more noticeably. They stopped just outside the doorway. A priest stands nearby, though he does not speak first. In earlier centuries, the priest's presence was not always required for a marriage to be considered real. What mattered most was something simpler. The couple had to speak their agreement aloud. This tradition was shaped by church law collected by scholars such as Gratian in the 12th century, who gathered earlier teachings into a clear understanding that mutual consent created a binding union. In other words, the marriage began when the couple said yes to one another in public hearing. No elaborate objects were necessary. No written contract had to be unfolded. No ring was strictly required. 2 voices were enough. You watch as the couple turns slightly toward one another, close enough that their sleeves brush together in the narrow space before the door. Their words are not loud. They don't need to be. Everyone standing listens nearby carefully. They promise to remain together as husband and wife. The moment is brief. It lasts no longer than the time needed to tie a knot in a length of cord, yet its meaning settles across the gathered neighbors with surprising weight. The village hears the promise and accepts it. That acceptance is what gives the words strength. Nearby, Edric the carpenter shifts his weight slightly as he listens. Earlier that morning, he had been adjusting a loose hinge along the church doorframe, tapping it gently back into place so it would close without catching. Now he stands with his hands resting quietly at his sides, watching the couple speak. For him, the moment must feel familiar in a different way. He understands how small adjustments can change how something holds together. A marriage, like a door, depends on alignment more than decoration. The priest steps forward after the couple has spoken and offered a blessing. His words are longer than theirs, but they are not what creates the marriage. Instead, they surround it, like a frame placed carefully around a finished piece of work. This pattern was common in many regions of medieval Europe. Wedding rites recorded in traditions such as the Sarum service show that vows spoken at the church door formed the central moment of the union, while later prayers inside the building strengthened what had already begun. So the doorway remains the heart of the ceremony. A few neighbors nod quietly to one another. Someone shifts a basket from one arm to the other. A child leans briefly against a parent's cloak and then stands upright again. These small movements do not interrupt the moment. They belong to it. Marriage here is not distant from everyday life. It grows directly out of it. You may notice that no one seems surprised by what has just happened. There is no sudden cheer, no dramatic signal. Instead, there is a shared understanding spreading gently through the crowd. The couple has spoken. The household exists. It is almost surprising how little was required to make something so lasting. A doorway, a few witnesses, and 2 promises spoken clearly were enough to change how everyone in the village will now greet them. Even Edric glanced once at the hinge he repaired earlier, as if quietly satisfied that the door will open and close properly for many years yet. The couple now prepares to step inside the church for further blessing, but the essential moment has already passed. The village has heard what it needed to hear. And before the afternoon light begins to soften, bowls of stew and cups of ale will be waiting nearby, ready to carry this new household into the warmth of shared celebration. By the time the couple steps back out from the church doorway, the feeling of the day begins to change. The stillness that follows the vows does not disappear. It softens. It spreads. What was once quiet attention now becomes movement again, as neighbors turn toward the open yard where tables are already beginning to form from borrowed balanced boards across wooden trestles. The wedding has entered its warmest moment. Someone carries out a clay pot filled with stew that has been simmering slowly since morning. Someone else sets down a basket of bread beside it, still faintly warm from the ovens. A jug of ale passes from one pair of hands to another without needing instruction. You notice that no single person appears to be in charge. This is not a feast prepared by servants. It is a gathering assembled by memory. Everyone knows what must be done because they have done it before, and because one day they expect the same kindness will return to them. The first bowls are filled carefully and passed outward. The stew is simple, thick with onions and barley and whatever vegetables the season allowed to be stored. It is not meant to impress anyone. It is meant to last long enough for conversation to begin. You take a place along the edge of the gathering where the sunlight falls gently across the grass. Nearby, children continue moving between the tables without being called back. No one seems concerned if they eat before the older guests. Weddings are not arranged like ordinary meals. They are allowed to unfold more freely, like animals settling into a field where everyone already understands the boundaries without needing fences. Ale begins to move more quickly now. It is poured into wooden cups, then passed again and again from one group to another. In many villages, Ale is safer to drink than water drawn from uncertain streams, and so its presence here feels natural rather than extravagant. Even those who rarely drink much on ordinary days accept a cup now. Warmth spreads gradually through the gathering. Someone begins tapping a rhythm against the side of a bowl. Another neighbor answers with a short melody played on a reed pipe that has likely been carried to many weddings before this one. Soon, the sound becomes something larger than either of them intended. Circles begin to form almost without anyone noticing when they began. Hands join hands, steps follow steps. The movement is simple enough that even those who do not know the pattern can follow by watching others nearby. No one performs alone. No one needs to. At the edge of the circle stands Lysa, the shepherd's niece. She has not yet stepped forward to join the dancers. Instead, she watches carefully, her hands resting loosely at her sides as she follows the pattern with her eyes first. The hem of her dress shifts slightly in the breeze, and she smiles once when someone stumbles and quickly recovers their footing. For her, this gathering holds another kind of meaning. Weddings are not only celebrations of households already formed, they are places where new ones quietly begin. Young people notice one more easily when everyone is gathered together in the same open space. Conversations begin that might not have happened on ordinary days when work keeps everyone separated across fields and pastures. It is often said, half in jest but rarely denied, that many marriages begin at someone else's wedding. Here, you can almost see how it happens. A shared cup of ale passed from one hand to another, a brief exchange of laughter over a misstep in the dance, a promise to help carry a bench back across the lane after sunset. None of these moments announces themselves as important, yet each of them carries the possibility of something lasting. The music continues, steady and unhurried. Even the older neighbors begin to move a little closer to the circle, although they do not always step inside it. They watch instead, speaking quietly with one another while reminding weddings that took place years earlier in the same yard. Somewhere nearby, a descent rises briefly and then fades again. Perhaps someone believes another guest has taken more ale than their share. Perhaps an old story has been repeated too many times. Such small samples are not unusual on days like this. They pass quickly, like sheep nudging one another along a narrow path before settling again into calm movement. The couple themselves move among the guests now, no longer standing apart at the church doorway, but walking as part of the gathering. Neighbors greet them differently already. Where once they might have been addressed separately, now they are greeted together. A loaf is given to both of them at once. A bench is shifted to make space for them side by side. Without any announcement, the village has begun treating them as a household. This change is quiet, but unmistakable. You begin to understand that the feast is doing more than filling stomachs. It is teaching everyone how to recognize the couple in their new place among them. The sun has moved higher now, and shadows shorten across the yard. Steam rises from the last bowls of stew still being passed between guests. The music slows for a moment as someone pauses to rest their hands, yet the gathering does not feel as though it is ending. Instead, it feels as though it is preparing for one more step, a smaller, quieter step that will carry the marriage beyond shared food and into something more private and lasting. Before evening settles over the village, the couple will be led toward a doorway of their own, where the household that begins in public words will become something fully real in the eyes of their neighbors. As the afternoon light begins to soften and the last bowls from the feast are quietly set aside, the shape of the wedding day changes once more. The laughter does not disappear. The music does not end all at once. Instead, the gathering slowly becomes smaller, more focused, as neighbors begin turning their attention toward something quieter and more deliberate. Until now, the marriage has belonged to everyone. Soon, it will belong more fully to the couple themselves. You notice that the gifts brought earlier in the day are no longer resting in loose piles near the tables. They are being carried one by one toward the doorway of the couple's new home. Each object moves slowly through many hands before reaching its place. A sack of grain is placed carefully beside the threshold. A wooden stool is placed just inside the entrance. A small bundle of dried herbs is hung from a peg where it will remain within easy reach during winter meals. None of these things are expensive. None are meant to impress visitors. Yet together they form something much more valuable than decoration. They form stability. In medieval villages, a wedding does not mark the beginning of comfort. It marks the beginning of cooperation. A household must be able to cook, store, repair, and endure. That is why gifts so often include tools instead of ornaments, seeds instead of silver, animals instead of embroidery. A chicken can produce eggs. A sack of barley can stretch across many evenings. A wooden spoon can last longer than memory. Occasionally, a wedding gift even arrives with its own opinions about where it would rather be. It is not uncommon for a goat or a hen to wander away briefly from its new home before anyone notices, reminds everyone present that even the most practical gifts sometimes require gentle persuasion to stay where they are needed. The couple accepts each offering with quiet attention. They do not speak much as the objects arrive. There is no need for long thanks. Everyone understands what these gifts mean. They are not symbols. They are promises made in wood and grain and feather. Nearby, neighbors begin preparing one final custom of the day, the couple's bedding. In some villages, this moment is accompanied by laughter and teasing remarks from older relatives. In others, it is handled more quietly, yet the meaning remains the same. A marriage spoken aloud before testifying is considered complete when the couple begins their life together in private as well as in public. Church courts in later centuries would sometimes be asked to decide whether a marriage had truly taken place, and one of the questions they considered was whether the couple had shared a bed after their vows. This did not make the marriage romantic in the modern sense. It made it recognized. Completion meant certainty. As evening approaches, the doorway of the couple's house becomes the center of attention once more. A small lamp has already been placed inside. Its flame moves gently each time someone passes through the entrance. Shadows stretch longer across the packed earth outside, and the sounds of the village begin to quiet as animals are led back toward their pens for the night. Thomas, the ditch farmer, returns again at this hour. Earlier in the morning, you saw him repairing his bucket beside the path. Now he carries a sack across one shoulder, walking carefully so that its weight does not shift too quickly as he steps. When he reaches the doorway, he lowers it slowly to the ground. Onions, enough to flavor many meals in the coming weeks. He does not remain long after setting them down. Like most of the neighbors, he understands that the day is drawing toward its final moment. The household has been welcomed. The gifts have been given. The promises have been spoken. There is very little left for the village to do. One by one, people begin stepping back from the doorway. Not suddenly, not all at once. Instead, they move away the way stars become visible in an evening sky, slowly, quietly, each departing, leaving the space around the couple clearer than before. The yard that was filled with movement earlier now holds only a few lingering voices speaking softly near the path. Inside the house, the lamp continues to glow. The couple will remain there together now, beginning the work that every household must learn, sharing tools, sharing bread, sharing winter nights, and sharing whatever seasons arrive next. You may notice that no final announcement marks the end of the wedding. No bell rings, no signal is given. The village simply understands. Where there were once two neighbors walking separate paths, there is now one doorway that belongs to both of them. And as darkness settles slowly across the roofs and fences of the village, your attention begins to drift farther away, toward another gathering in another land, where men recline beside shallow cups of diluted wine, preparing to shape conversation as carefully as this village shaped a household today. As the evening deepens over the village you have just left behind, your attention begins to travel farther south, across warmer seas and brighter skies, toward another kind of gathering. Here, the air carries the faint scent of olive oil lamps instead of wood smoke, and the ground beneath your feet feels smoother, paved in worn stone rather than packed earth. The doorway before you is wider than the one you stood aside earlier, yet what happens inside it will also shape how a community understands itself. You are about to enter a Greek drinking room. The gathering waiting there is called a symposium, which simply means a drinking together. But the meaning of the word stretches further than the cups placed carefully along the walls. It describes a space where conversation is shaped with the same attention that villagers once gave to vows at a church doorway. You step inside. The room is not large, yet it feels carefully arranged. Along the walls stand low couches covered with woven fabric. Guests do not sit upright on benches here. Instead, they recline on one elbow, turning slightly toward one another so their voices travel easily across the space between them. This arrangement matters. It allows everyone to see one another without anyone standing above the rest. Conversation can move slowly from one speaker to another, the way music travels between instruments in a quiet ensemble. Oil lamps flicker along the edges of the room, their light catching on the curved surfaces of clay cups waiting to be filled. Before anyone begins drinking, however, something important must happen. Wine is brought forward in a large mixing bowl placed at the center of the gathering, but no one drank it immediately. In Greek custom, wine is almost always combined with water before it is shared. Drinking it without mixing would seem reckless, even a little embarrassing, as though someone had forgotten the careful balance expected of a thoughtful guest. So water is poured first. Then wine follows. The mixture is stirred slowly with a ladle until the color deepens into something softer than either liquid alone. Only then is it carried around the room. It is sometimes said, half seriously and half in humor, that drinking unmixed wine would make a guest appear less like a philosopher and more like someone who had simply lost their way on the road home. Here, balance is part of respect. You take a place among the others reclining along the walls. The fabric beneath your arm is warm from the lamplight, and the quiet movement of voices around you begins to settle into a gentle rhythm. Across the room sits a young student named Nikon. He's been invited for the first time. His posture is careful, almost too careful, as he adjusts his position on the couch and watches how others accept their cups. He doesn't yet speak much. Instead, he listens. Listening is expected here. A symposium is not just a place to drink. It is a place to learn how to speak well, how to disagree without anger, and how to shape thoughts so they travel clearly from one person to another. Older guests often guide younger ones through conversation as patiently as farmers once guided new household through shared work. Nikon holds his cup with both hands at first, as though uncertain whether he should raise it immediately or wait for someone else to begin. When the guest beside him nods gently, he takes a small sip and relaxes slightly. The evening has begun. Somewhere nearby, a servant refills the mixing bowl again, carefully repeating the same process of blending water and wine. The motion becomes part of the sound of the room, the quiet splash of liquid, the soft movement of ladles, the low murmur of voices growing more confident as each guest settles into place. You begin to notice how conversation itself moves differently here. No one speaks loudly enough to dominate the room. Instead, each voice rises and falls in turn, like notes passing between strings of a lyre. A story begins at one couch, travels halfway across the circle, pauses for laughter, then continues in a slightly different form as someone adds another thought. The room listens as much as it speaks. This was not accidental. Writers such as Xenophon describe these gatherings as places where men practice the art of thoughtful conversation. Learning to speak carefully in a symposium prepare a person to speak carefully in public life as well. Words shaped here could later guide decisions made in assemblies, courts, and councils across the city. So even when laughter appears, it does not break the rhythm of attention. Nikon watches closely as an older guest begins reciting a short passage of poetry from memory. The words move slowly through the lamplit air, each line carried by a voice that has likely spoken them many times before. When the recitation ends, another guest responds with a different poem, slightly shorter but no less careful. The exchange feels less like competition and more like tuning an instrument together. Around you, cups continue to pass from hand to hand. The mixture inside them remains gentle enough that conversation can continue without interruption. No one rushes, no one drinks alone. You begin to understand that this room is doing something similar to what the village did earlier in the day. There, a household was formed through shared agreement. Here, a circle of voices is being formed through shared attention. And before the evening continues much further, someone in the room will be asked to guide how strongly the wine should remain, quietly shaping the rhythm of everything that follows. The room has already settled into its quiet rhythm by the time you begin to notice that someone is watching the wine more carefully than the others. He is not seated in a higher place. He does not speak more loudly. At first, he seemed no different from the other guests reclining along the walls. Yet each time the large mixing bowl is refilled, his eyes follow the motion of the ladle, and each time a servant pauses before pouring, they glance toward him before continuing. This is the guest who quietly guides the evening. In gatherings like this, someone is chosen to decide how strongly the mixture of wine and water should remain as the conversation unfolds. Rather than using the formal Greek term often written in books, you might think of him simply as the keeper of balance for the night. His role is subtle but important. Too little water in the mixture, and conversation might become loud and careless. Too much water, and the evening could lose its warmth before ideas have time to grow. So he watches the bowl with the same attention a farmer might give to changing clouds above a field, adjusting expectations before a storm has time to form. Nearby, the bronze ladle dips again into the mixing bowl. Water first, then wine. The motion repeats slowly, never rushed. Each adjustment is small enough that few guests notice it directly, yet everyone feels its effect. Voices remain steady. Laughter rises and falls without becoming sharp. Thought moves forward without stumbling. It is sometimes said, gently and without accusation, that wisdom begins when someone chooses to add more water than pride would normally allow. Across the room, Nikon watches this process with careful interest. Earlier in the evening, he was unsure how to hold his cup or when to speak. Now he has taken out a small wax tablet and rests it across his knees. With a narrow stylus held between his fingers, he begins copying a short line of poetry that one of the older guests recited only moments ago. The surface of the wax receives each letter slowly. He's not writing to impress anyone. He's writing so the words will remain with him after the lamps burn low and the gathering ends. For younger guests, evenings like this are as much about memory as they are about conversation. Across the couches, discussion begins to widen. One guest asks whether courage is something a person is born with or something that grows through practice. Another answers with a story about a soldier who learned bravery only after many small failures. A third responds with a brief verse that compares courage to standing steady in shifting wind. The conversation does not move in straight lines. Instead, it travels gently from speaker to speaker, circling the room like weather drifting across open water. Each voice adds something new without forcing the others aside. Even dissent sounds calm here, shaped by patience rather than urgency. The guest guiding the wine continues his quiet work. When he noticed cups being emptied more quickly than before, he signals for the next mixture to include a little more water. When the room grows too quiet, he allows the mixture to deepen slightly again. No announcement is made, no explanation is offered. Yet the rhythm of the evening changes with each adjustment. Balance, here, is not accidental. Writers such as Plutarch later described gatherings like this as places where conversation itself was treated almost like a shared craft. Guests learned how to listen without interrupting, how to answer without dismissing, and how to speak in ways that invited others to continue rather than withdraw. The wine helped make this possible, not because it removed restraint, but because it softened hesitation. Nikon pauses in his writing for a moment and looks up again. Someone nearby has begun describing a journey taken across the sea many years earlier. The story is not dramatic. It contains no sudden danger or heroic rescue. Instead, it describes long hours of rowing beneath steady sunlight and nights spent watching unfamiliar stars rising above the water. Even so, the room listens carefully. Stories here are not valued for their excitement. They are valued for the way they help listeners understand the person speaking them. Another guest responds with a short observation about friendship, how it sometimes forms not through shared victories, but through shared patience. The thought lingers in the air for a moment before someone else quietly agrees. The lamps burn lower as the evening deepens. Their light moves gently across the curved surfaces of the cups, across the folds of woven fabric on the couches, across Nikon's wax tablet where the copied poem now rests complete. He studies it once more before smoothing a small section of the wax with his thumb, making space for another line he hopes to remember later. All the while, the mixing bowl continues its quiet work at the center of the room. You begin to understand that the guest guiding the wine is shaping more than the strength of the drink. He is shaping the pace of trust. He is helping each voice arrive at the right moment, neither too quickly nor too late, so that conversation can grow without strain. In this way, the evening becomes something shared rather than something performed. And before long, the voices around the room will begin turning toward deeper questions about friendship, about beauty, and about what kind of life deserves to be called honorable. As the evening continues, the rhythm of conversation begins to change again. At first, voices had carefully moved from one guest to another, each speaker testing the space before adding a thought. Now the room feels warmer, steadier, more willing to let ideas wander a little further. The mixing bowl still rests at the center, watched quietly by the guest guiding its balance, but attention has begun shifting toward something older than debate and just as important: music. Someone reaches for a lyre resting against the wall. The instrument is small enough to hold easily across the lap. Its curved wooden arms caught the lamplight as it is lifted. When the first string is touched, the sound is soft and clear, like a single bird calling before dawn. No one interrupts. No one speaks over it. Instead, the room leans gently toward the sound, as though it were something living that had just entered the gathering. The melody begins slowly. It does not hurry forward. It circles itself once, then again, allowing each guest time to follow its shape. In gatherings like this, music is not meant to fill silence. It is meant to guide attention. Soon, another guest joins with a short recitation of verse. The poem is not dramatic. It speaks instead about friendship, about the patience required to understand another person's character, and about the quiet strength that grows when people remain loyal to one another through ordinary days. When the final line settles into the air, someone nearby repeats part of it softly, as though testing how the words feel when spoken again. Across the couch beside you, the visiting companion woman listens carefully before responding. Women who attend gatherings like this are not present in the same role as wives waiting at home. They are trained in music, memory, and conversation. Many guests listen to them with the same respect they offer poets and teachers. When she speaks, her voice is steady, and the thought she offers is simple but clear. She suggests that friendship may not always begin with agreement. Sometimes it begins with curiosity. The room grows quiet for a moment after she says this, not because the idea is surprising, but because it fits so easily with what others have already shared. Several guests nod without speaking. The conversation shifts again, not sharply, but the way a group of grazing animals turns together toward a new patch of grass without needing instruction. Music returns. This time, the rhythm is lighter. A guest taps the edge of a cup gently with one finger. Another answer by striking the side of a small bowl with a spoon. The sounds overlap, not perfectly, but comfortably enough that they begin to feel like part of the same pattern. Laughter follows soon after. Someone proposes a small game that often appears in evenings like this. A shallow cup is lifted and tilted slightly, and a drop of wine is flicked toward a small target placed across the room. The aim is not to strike it perfectly. The aim is simply to try. The first attempt misses. A second lands closer. By the third attempt, several guests are leaning forward with quiet anticipation, watching the arc of each drop as it travels through the lamplight before disappearing against the floor. Even philosophy, it seems, occasionally begins with a spilled drink. No one treats the game as competition. Instead, it becomes another way to share attention. Each attempt invites a small burst of laughter, followed by another line of poetry or another short story offered in response. Conversation continues moving forward, carried along by the gentle playfulness of the moment. The visiting companion woman joins the game once, misses the target entirely, and smiles without embarrassment. Her ease makes the others more comfortable as well. Soon, the room returns again to discuss, though now the voices sound warmer than before. Someone asks whether beauty is something that belongs only to the body, or whether it also belongs to the mind. Another guest answers by recalling a speech described long ago in a gathering like this one, preserved in the writings of Plato, where beauty was said to begin in visible form, but lead gradually toward something less easily seen. The idea is offered quietly, without insistence, as though it were simply another path worth walking for a little while. The room listens. Nikon, located nearby, has stopped writing for the moment. He watches the exchange with the careful attention of someone who knows he will remember this evening long after it ends. For him, the combination of music, laughter, and thought feels new but also strangely familiar, as if he'd been preparing for it without realizing. Around him, the lamps continued their slow movement. Their flames lean slightly whenever someone shifts position on a couch. Shadows stretch across the walls, then fold back again as another melody begins. The lyre returns once more, this time playing a tune softer than before. Its notes spaced widely enough that each one has time to settle before the next appears. The gathering no longer feels like a lesson, it feels like a shared journey. You begin to understand that evenings like this shaped more than entertainment. They shaped memory. They shaped friendship. They shaped the way people learn to think together rather than alone. And yet, even in a room so carefully arranged for conversation, not everyone in the city would be welcomed here. Beyond these walls, others continue their evening without hearing any of the voices that have filled this space tonight. As the evening deepens, and the lamps burn lower along the walls of the room, you begin to notice something else about the gathering. It is not only shaped by who speaks, it is shaped by who is absent. The couches around the room hold men who belong to the civic life of the city. They are citizens, landholders, teachers, soldiers, poets, and students preparing to become some of these things themselves. Each voice here carries weight not only because of what is said, but because of who has been invited to say it. Outside the doorway, the streets continue quietly. Families share evening meals, wives manage household, workers return from markets and workshops. None of them are part of this circle tonight. The symposium does not pretend to represent the entire city. Instead, it gathers one particular group whose conversations are expected to shape public life in the years ahead. Inside the room, however, conversation remains gentle rather than formal. You may notice that no single speaker stands at the center to deliver a long lesson. Instead, ideas travel sideways from couch to couch, moving between voices the way thread moves through cloth as it is woven into shape. Knowledge here is not handed down from above, it is built together through exchange. It is sometimes said, with quiet humor, that wisdom in rooms like this does not arrive from a raised platform. It travels sideways across cushions. Nearby, Nikon listens carefully as an older guest begins speaking directly to him for the first time. The older man does not lecture. He does not ask questions meant to test memory. Instead, he shares a short reflection about loyalty between companions and the importance of learning when to speak and when to remain silent. His tone suggests neither correction nor authority. It suggests guidance. In gatherings like this, relationships between older and younger participants often carry an educational meaning. Younger guests learn how to speak clearly, how to listen without interruption, and how to recognize the responsibilities that came with citizenship. Older guests offered example rather than instruction, shaping habits through presence as much as through words. This kind of learning did not resemble the lessons of a schoolroom. It resembled apprenticeship. A younger guest watched how an experienced speaker chose his moment. He noted how dissents were softened rather than sharpened. He learned how stories could carry arguments without turning conversation into conflict. These small observations stayed with him long after the lamps were extinguished. Across the room, the visiting companion woman continues listening as well. Her presence reminds you again that the gathering is selective, but not silent in its variety. While wives remained outside such spaces, trained companions were welcomed because of their skill in music, poetry, and conversation. They contribute not only entertainment, but perspective. Their voices helped widen the circle without changing its structure. Plato's description of gatherings like this preserves many examples of speeches about friendship, desire, and beauty that unfolded across evenings much like this one. Later, such writers as Xenophon described similar scenes, emphasizing how conversation itself became a form of shared education. Modern historians, including Oswin Murray, have suggested that these meetings shaped the habits of discussion that later influenced political life across Greek cities. You begin to understand why the arrangement of couches mattered so much. Each guest can see the others. Each voice could travel without obstruction. No one stood above the rest for long. The architecture of the room encourages equality in speech, even while the invitation list itself remains limited. Outside, the night has deepened. Through the doorway, you can see only a narrow portion of the street beyond. A lantern passes once, carried by someone returning home. Its light slides briefly across the threshold before disappearing again into darkness. Inside, the final cups of the evening are being passed. Conversation is slowed down now, not because ideas have ended, but because the hour has grown late. One guest stretches slightly before rising from his couch. Another folds the edge of a woven cover more neatly across his seat before standing. The movement spreads quietly through the room until the gathering begins to loosen. Nikon waits until the others have begun stepping toward the doorway before standing as well. Outside, the night air feels cooler than before. The stone beneath his sandals holds the last warmth of the day, but the sky above has already darkened enough for stars to appear among the rooftops. He walks slowly along the street, the words he heard still moving through his thoughts as steadily as the rhythm of his footsteps. Even after the voices fade behind him, their shape remains. He has learned something tonight that cannot be written easily onto a wax tablet. He has learned how conversation itself can build a community of listeners as well as speakers. He has learned that ideas shared among companions may travel far beyond the walls where they first appeared. Ahead of him, the street opens toward quieter neighborhoods where lamps burn in household courtyards and families prepare for sleep. Far to the south, along a different river and beneath a different sky, another kind of preparation is already beginning. One that does not shape conversation through wine and poetry, but shapes the human body itself through scent, color, and careful attention to balance. Far to the south of the lamplit streets you have just left behind, the air changes again. Here, the morning begins earlier and more brightly. Sunlight arrives not through narrow stone lanes, but across wide riverbanks where reeds move slowly in warm breezes, and the surface of the Nile reflects pale gold before the heat of the day fully settles in. Houses are built of mud brick rather than stone, and inside them, the quiet routines of preparation begin long before the marketplace fills with voices. You step into a shaded room where the day's first ritual is already underway. It begins without clothing. It begins with a mirror. The mirror rests on a low wooden table near an open window where the morning air moves gently through linen curtains. Its surface is not glass, as you might expect in a later century, but polished bronze, carefully rubbed until it reflects light with a soft, warm glow rather than a sharp shine. When you look into it, your reflection appears slightly deeper in tone, as though it partly belongs to shadow as well as light. Mirrors like this were not ordinary household objects. Many were shaped with handles that echoed the form of Hathor, a goddess associated with beauty, joy, and protection. Holding such a mirror meant holding something that connected daily life with something larger and more enduring than appearance alone. It is easy to imagine, with a quiet smile, that the mirror is watching you as attentively as you are watching yourself. Near the window stands Nebet. She has already washed her face using cool water carried earlier from a nearby jar. The air around her holds a faint trace of lotus oil, applied lightly at the wrists and along the sides of her neck, where the skin warms quickly in the morning sun. She does not hurry. Preparation here follows a rhythm learned through repetition rather than instruction. Beside the mirror lies a small palette made of smooth stone. Across its surface rest traces of green and dark mineral powder. These are not decorations in the modern sense. They are part of a practice that combines cleanliness, protection, and identity into a single gesture repeated every day. Nabit lifts a small applicator carved from wood and pauses briefly before beginning. In household along the Nile, grooming was not separated from order. A well-prepared appearance reflects harmony with the world around you. It suggested that your body, your household, and your place within the wider balance of life remained properly aligned. This idea of balance was sometimes described by a quiet word the Egyptians used for the harmony that held the universe together. It shaped how people arranged their homes, how they cared for their families, and how they prepared themselves each morning before stepping outside. So even small actions carry meaning. Nabit dips the applicator gently into the mineral powder and draws a thin line along the edge of one eyelid. The motion is careful, but practiced. She doesn't need to look closely at her hand as she works. Instead, she watches the mirror and allows memory to guide the movement. Nearby, a child passes briefly through the doorway and pauses to watch before continuing outside again. Grooming was not private in the way it might seem today. It was part of the shared rhythm of the household, as familiar as grinding grain or carrying water. The mirror reflects all of this quietly. Outside the window, the light has grown stronger now, spreading across the courtyard and catching the edge of a storage jar placed beside the wall. A bird crosses the open sky above the roofline, its shadow passing across the window for only a moment before disappearing again. Inside the room, Nabit reaches for a small container of scented oil. Perfume in this world did not arrive in glass bottles with narrow necks. Instead, it was often stored in small carved jars made of alabaster or clay, their smooth surfaces cool even in warm air. The oil itself was thick and slow-moving, carrying the scent of flowers that had been pressed and filtered carefully over many days. She applies only a little. Too much scent would not suggest refinement. It would suggest carelessness. In household across Egypt, both men and women followed similar routines. Clean skin, scented oil, carefully arranged hair or wigs, and protective eye paint formed part of ordinary preparation rather than special celebration. These practices help guard against sun glare, insects, and infection, but they also marked belonging within a community that values visible order. The mirror remains at the center of this process. Archaeologists have found examples of mirrors placed carefully inside tombs, beside combs, cosmetic spoons, and small jars of pigment. This suggests that grooming was expected to continue even beyond death, not as decoration, but as part of remaining complete in another world. Nabit sets the mirror down once she is finished. For a moment, she studies the reflection again. Not to change anything further, but simply to confirm what has already been done. The room is quiet, except for the faint movement of linen at the window and the distant sound of someone sweeping the courtyard outside. Morning preparation is nearly complete. Soon she will step into the brightness beyond the doorway, joining others whose appearances carry the same careful signs of attention. Together, these small rituals create something larger than individual beauty. They create recognition. And before long, the dark lines drawn around the eyes will begin to reveal another purpose as well, one that protects as much as it adorns. The morning light has grown stronger now, and with it the details of preparation become easier to see. What first appears to be simple decoration begins to reveal another purpose. You notice the dark line that Nabit drew earlier along the edge of her eyelids. In the brightness of the courtyard outside, it catches the light differently than before. Rather than fading into shadow, it sharpens the outline of her gaze, making her expression clearer even from across the room. This dark line is called kohl. It is one of the most familiar features of Egyptian appearance, yet it was never only cosmetic. Like many things in this landscape shaped by river water and desert wind, it was made to serve more than one purpose at once. Nearby, in a shaded corner of the house, a young apprentice sits beside a low stone slab. He holds a small grinding stone in one hand and moves it slowly across a shallow pallet where fragments of dark mineral rest in a narrow pile. The motion is steady and patient, producing a fine powder that gathers slowly beneath his fingers. He does not hurry. Grinding pigment is careful work, and the surface must become smooth enough to rest comfortably against the skin. This powder will become eye paint. Minerals such as galena, a soft dark stone containing lead salts, were commonly used in preparing kohl. Modern studies of surviving cosmetic containers suggest that when these minerals were mixed with moisture from the skin, they encouraged the body to produce small protective responses that helped guard against infection around the eyes. Long before anyone described such processes in scientific language, people along the Nile understood their effects through observation. Those who wore kohl suffer fewer irritations in the brightness of the sun. Their eyes remained clearer in the presence of river insects. Their vision stayed more comfortable during long days spent working near water where reflected light could be strong enough to cause strain. So the dark line around the eye became something like a shield, shaped by craft rather than metal. The apprentice lifts the pallet slightly and tilts it toward the doorway, checking how the powder settles in the morning light. When he is satisfied with its texture, he reaches for a small wooden stick carved thin at one end. This will serve as the applicator, allowing the pigment to be placed exactly where it is needed. Such tools appear often in burial collections discovered by archaeologists. Many are carefully shaped, sometimes carved with animal forms or floral patterns that suggest attention even to objects used every day. Grooming was not rushing work here. It was shaped as carefully as weaving cloth or carving wood. Across the courtyard, Nebet applies another fine line of kohl along her lower eyelid. The motion is practiced enough that she does not pause to adjust it later. The line settles into place as though it had always existed there. In the sunlight, it deepens the contrast between skin and shadow, making her eyes easier to read from a distance. In a place where expression traveled across open courtyards and busy riverbanks, clarity mattered. But protection mattered as well. The brightness of the Egyptian sky could be intense even in early hours. Light reflected from water, pale stone, and sand all at once, surrounding the eye from many directions. A narrow band of dark pigment helps soften that brightness, much as a narrow awning softens the edge of a doorway facing the sun. Beauty here was never separated from usefulness. It worked quietly alongside daily life. You might even say with a small smile that the eye paint performed the duties of a careful physician without ever asking for recognition. The apprentice sets aside the grinding stone once his work is completed. He poured the finished powder into a small container carved from alabaster, its smooth surface cool despite the warmth outside. Containers like this were often shaped with narrow openings to protect their contents from dust, and many were sealed with simple lids made from wood or linen. Each jar carries not only pigment, but preparation. In some households, different shades were used at different times of day. Darker tones might appear during travel beneath strong sunlight, while softer tones accompany indoor gatherings. The variation was subtle, yet deliberate. Nearby, another member of the household prepares similar mixtures of green pigment made from crushed malachite. This color, too, appears around the eyes, offering both visual distinction and protection. The practice extends across age and gender. Men used kohl, women used kohl. Children sometimes wore lighter forms of it as well. Appearance here was not divided sharply into categories of decoration and function. Instead, it formed part of the larger effort to remain in harmony with surroundings shaped by river water, wind, and heat. As the morning advances, voices begin to gather outside the house. Footsteps pass along the courtyard wall. Someone calls to a neighbor across the lane. A basket is lifted. A door opens and closes again. The day has begun fully now, and the careful preparation of faces and hands becomes part of the shared rhythm of movement through the settlement. Nebet sets aside her applicator and studies her reflection once more in the polished bronze mirror resting nearby. Nothing further needs adjusting. The lines are complete. The scent of oil still lingers faintly at her wrists. The pigments have settled where they belong. Soon, attention will turn upward toward the hairline, where another small object waits to soften the warmth of the sun and release fragrance slowly through the hours ahead. As the morning continues to unfold along the riverbank settlement, attention shifts slowly upward from the eyes to the hairline. There, another quiet ritual is waiting. Inside the shaded room, Nebet reaches toward a wooden stand where her wig has been resting since dawn. It is carefully shaped, darker than her natural hair, and braided with a precision that suggests patient hands worked many evenings before it was finished. She lifts it gently, not as one lifts clothing, but as one lifts something that holds its own place in daily order. In ancient Egypt, wigs were not unusual additions reserved only for ceremony. They were practical, protective, and expressive at the same time. The climate along the Nile was warm for much of the year. Shaving the head helped reduce heat and discourage insects. A wig, placed afterward, allowed a person to appear prepared and composed while still remaining comfortable beneath the sun. It also makes grooming easier, since braided fibers can be arranged and adjusted without the daily effort required by natural hair. Nebet settles the wig carefully into place. The movement is familiar enough that she does not pause midway. Her fingers follow the edges lightly, ensuring that it rests evenly above her temples and behind her ears. The weight is gentle. The shape frames her face without hiding it. Nearby, a small carved container waits beside the mirror. Inside, it rests something that would appear to unusual eyes, a pale cone of scented wax, carefully shaped so that it can be placed at the crown of the head. This is not decoration meant only for display. It is a quiet companion that will travel with her through the day. She lifts the cone and places it gently against the wig. As the warmth of the sun rises, the wax will gradually soften, releasing fragrance in small waves that drift downward across the shoulders and sleeves. The scent may include lotus, myrrh, or other resins gathered from trade routes stretching far beyond the river valley. These fragrances did not arrive quickly. They carry the memory of distant landscapes. Soon, as she walks through the courtyard, others will notice her presence before they see her face. Your hairstyle, in a place like this, sometimes arrived before you did. Paintings preserved on tomb walls in Thebes show guests at gatherings wearing these cones as they sit beside one another in shaded rooms much like this one. The images suggest that fragrance was not hidden. It was shared. It moves gently through space, linking people together through something less visible than speech. Scent here was part of recognition. It suggested care. It suggested discretion. It suggested that a person understood their place within the wider pattern of daily life. Across the courtyard, Nebet steps into the filtered sunlight beneath a reed canopy stretched between two walls. The air there feels cooler than in the open yard. A clay jar stands beside the doorway, its surface damp where water has been poured across it to lower the temperature of the room inside. Visitors have already begun arriving. A neighbor pauses near the entrance and greets her with a quiet nod. Another sets down a basket of dates near the wall before adjusting the edge of a linen shawl across her shoulders. No one comments directly on the scent drifting from Nebet's hair, yet it shapes the space between them all the same. Fragrance travels differently than sound. It moves slowly, settling into corners, lingering in woven fabric, attaching itself gently to memory. Long after footsteps have faded across the courtyard floor, scent may remain behind, reminding others who stood there earlier in the day. This is one reason perfume cones appear so often in burial scenes, as well as household paintings. The fragrance they released was believed to belong not only to the living moment, but to something more enduring. To carry scent was to carry presence. Nearby, another woman adjusts the edge of her own wig before greeting a visitor. A child passes between them, pausing only long enough to look upward before continuing across the courtyard toward the shade of the doorway. The movement is normal, yet the arrangement of hair, scent, and linen transforms it into something quietly deliberate. Men followed similar practices. They too shaved their heads for comfort in the heat. They too wore wigs arranged according to occasion and status. They too applied scented oils that softened the dryness of the air and marked their presence among others. Preparation here did not belong to one gender alone. It belongs to the shared understanding that the body itself formed part of social language. Archaeologists studying preserved wigs have found that some were made from human hair, carefully braided together, while others combined plant fibers and wool. The variation suggests that appearance could shift according to season, occupation, and available materials, just as clothing did in other parts of the world. Yet the purpose remains steady. To appear arranged was to appear balanced. Nabet greets another visitor now, gesturing toward the shaded bench near the wall where conversation can continue without standing beneath the full brightness of the courtyard sun. As she moves, the scent from the wax cone softens slightly, carried downward along the folds of her linen garment. The fragrance is not strong. It does not need to be. Its presence is sufficient. Before the day grows much warmer, attention will begin turning toward something even more lasting than scent. The small objects carefully prepared to accompany a person beyond the boundaries of ordinary life itself. As the day settles into its warmer hours and the courtyard conversations begin to slow, attention turns quietly toward another kind of preparation. This preparation is not for a gathering. It is not for a journey across the river. It is not even for tomorrow. It is for something much farther away. Inside a shaded storage room at the back of the house, where the air remains cooler and stiller than in the courtyard, a small group has begun arranging objects that will not be used again in ordinary life. Their purpose belongs to another time altogether. You step closer and notice that the objects are familiar. A mirror rests near the edge of a wooden chest. A small alabaster jar stands beside it. Nearby lies a cosmetic palette smoothed by many years of use. These are not being discarded. They are being prepared. In ancient Egypt, grooming tools were often placed inside tombs alongside clothing, amulets, and household objects. This was not done for decoration alone. It reflects a belief that the body, carefully prepared in life, would continue to require attention in whatever world followed after death. So even the smallest tools traveled forward. A household scribe kneels beside the chest now, wrapping each object carefully in linen before placing it inside. His movements are steady and deliberate. He doesn't rush. The work requires patience, not speed. He begins with the mirror. The bronze surface has been polished one final time. Even in the dim light of the storage room, it reflects a faint outline of the doorway behind him. He folds the linen around it slowly, pressing the edges flat with his palm so the wrapping will not loosen later. Beside him rests a small container once used for holding eye paint. He lifts it gently, checking its lid before placing it beside the mirror. Pigment containers like this appear often in tomb discoveries, sometimes still carrying traces of mineral powder after thousands of years. Their presence suggests that preparation of the eyes remains important even beyond the visible world. Nearby, another jar holds scented oil. The fragrance inside has softened with time, but it remains recognizable. Oils such as these were not only pleasant to wear during daily life, they were also associated with renewal and continuity, linking the body to cycles of warmth and light that returned each morning along the Nile. The scribe wraps the jar carefully and places it beside the others. It may seem surprising that so much attention was given to objects that would never again be used in ordinary ways. Yet for those preparing this chest, the work feels entirely practical. Completion required continuity. A person who entered the next world, incomplete, might not move easily within it. So mirrors traveling forward, pigments traveled away, combs, spoons, and small applicators traveled forward as well. Even eternity, it seems, required careful packing. The room remains quiet except for the soft sound of linen folding against bronze and stone. Each movement produces a faint rustling noise that lingers briefly before fading again. In this stillness, preparation feels less like an ending and more like a continuation spoken in another language. This idea of continuity was often described through a word the Egyptians used to express harmony between the visible world and the invisible one. It suggested balance rather than distance, order rather than separation. A life properly arranged would remain properly arranged even after crossing into another form of existence. The grooming tools inside this chest reflect that belief. They are not symbols of vanity. They are signs of readiness. Archaeologists studying tomb collections across Egypt have found cosmetic palettes shaped like fish, birds, and lotus flowers placed beside mirrors and pigment jars. These shapes were not chosen by accident. Each one resounds familiar elements of daily life along the river, linking memory of the landscape with preparation for what came next. The scribe pauses for a moment and looks toward the doorway before closing the chest. Outside, the courtyard remains bright. Voices still move between the walls. Someone passes carrying a basket of dates. Another adjusts a linen shawl near the entrance. Life continues without interruption. Yet inside the storage room, time feels slower, more devious. The chest is nearly ready now. One final strip of linen is folded across its contents before the lid is gently lowered into place. The sound it makes is soft enough that it almost disappears into the still air, like a quiet note once played and allowed to fade without echo. The work is finished. Preparation has extended as far as it can. Soon, the chest will travel to a place where sunlight does not reach in the same way, where walls are carved with images meant to preserve memory across generations yet to come. There, the mirror will rest beside the pigments, the oils will remain sealed, the comb will wait without movement, and together they will continue to speak, not through words, but through presence. Far beyond the riverbanks and reed canopies you have been walking beside, another settlement is taking shape along a distant shoreline where preparation means something completely different. There, survival itself will become the most important ritual of the day. The river appears before the settlement does. Long before you see any buildings, you notice the change in the air. It carries a softness that does not belong entirely to land or water. Mist hangs low above the surface, moving slowly between reeds that bend without sound. The shoreline stretches ahead in uneven curves, neither welcoming nor hostile, simply waiting. This is where the ships stop. After weeks of crossing open ocean, the wooden hull beneath your feet creaks differently now. The motion is slower, heavier. The vessel no longer rises and falls with deep waves, but settles into the quieter breathing of a river that moves with its own patience. You step down carefully. The ground feels uncertain at first, not because it shifts, but because it holds moisture close to the surface. Marsh grass grows thick along the edges of the landing place, and insects move in narrow circles above the waterline. The air smells of mud, salt, and something green that has not yet found a name in your memory. This is Jamestown. It does not look like the beginning of a colony. It looks like the beginning of a question. The settlement itself is still small. A few rough structures stand where trees cleared were only recently. Timber posts lean slightly where the soil has not yet learned how to hold them firmly. Smoke rises from one cooking fire, then disappears into the mist before it can travel far. Nothing here feels finished, and yet everything here has already been planned. Far across the ocean, in England, a group of investors known as the Virginia Company imagined this place long before anyone stepped ashore. They hoped the colony would discover valuable resources, establish trade, and return profit to those who supported the journey. For them, this shoreline existed first as a possibility drawn on paper maps rather than as a place where boots would sink slightly into wet ground. Now the possibility has become a responsibility. Thomas the carpenter steps down from the boat just ahead of you. He carries his tools wrapped carefully in cloth, holding them close against his side as though they might be needed at any moment. Unlike some of the other passengers, he does not look surprised by the unfinished appearance of the settlement. A carpenter hopes begins to look this way. Wood always arrives before walls. Around him, others step more cautiously. Some wear clothing that suggests they expected a different kind of arrival. Their sleeves are finely cut. Their boots are better suited to streets than marsh paths. These men are often described as gentlemen, a a word that once meant they were not accustomed to working the soil themselves. In England, such clothing makes sense. Here, it raises quiet questions. Fields have not yet been planted, fences have not yet been repaired, food stores are smaller than anyone expected. It is sometimes remembered, with gentle disbelief rather than criticism, that some settlers carried silver spoons across the ocean while forgetting to bring seeds. Even so, the work begins. Timber must be lifted, shelters must be repaired, water must be found that does not taste too strong of the tide moving upstream every day. The river beside the settlement looks calm, but its edges shift with the rhythm of distant currents. At certain hours, the water grows brackish, mixing fresh and salt together in ways that make drinking difficult. Settlers soon learn that not every clear surface offers safety. The land itself presents other challenges. Marsh air carries insects that move easily between standing water and open skin. Illness spreads quietly in such places, especially during warmer months when the river rises and falls with changing weather. Early accounts written by settlers describe fevers arriving without warning, leaving people weaker than expected in a place that already required careful strength. Thomas sets down his bundle of tools beside a half-finished wall. He studied the angle of two posts before adjusting one slightly with his foot. Even small changes matter here. A structure that stands straight today may lean tomorrow if the ground beneath it shifts again. Nearby, voices gather around a rough table where supplies are being counted. Flour, salted meat, tools, barrels of water carried from the ships. Each item is recorded carefully. Nothing can be replaced easily once it is gone. The nearest familiar harbor lies far beyond the horizon now. Yet the settlement does not feel silent. Men move between structures carrying timber beams across their shoulders. Someone begins digging a shallow trench where a wall will soon stand. Another group prepares a cooking fire, using branches gathered from the forest edge. Work spreads outward from the shoreline in small circles, like weather patterns forming slowly across open land. The river mist begins to lift. As it does, the outline of the settlement becomes clearer. A triangular palisade fence marks the first attempt to shape space into something safer. Inside it, narrow paths already connect doorways to one another, although the buildings themselves remain unfinished. Thomas lifts his tools again and walks toward the palisade. Each step he takes adds something to the settlement's future shape. A beam placed correctly today may hold a roof through winter storms months from now. A repaired wall may protect food stores that will matter greatly when colder weather arrives. This is how colonies begin. Not with certainty, with relocation. Around him, the others begin to understand that survival here will depend less on the plans made in England and more on the habits formed along this shoreline. Work must be shared differently. Expectations must change. Even the meaning of comfort begins to shift. The river continues moving beside the settlement without pause. Its surface reflects the sky above it in narrow bands of pale light. Boats rock gently where they are tied to the bank. Beyond them stretch a landscape that already belongs to neighboring communities who have lived along these waters far longer than the newcomers have imagined. Soon, the settlers will begin learning how much they depend on those neighbors for food, knowledge, and guidance. And before many weeks pass, hunger itself will quietly begin reshaping how work is shared among everyone who has stepped ashore here. Morning arrives quietly along the river, although it does not bring the kind of comfort many settlers expected. Mist still rests low over the marsh grass. The palisade walls, unfinished in places, hold the memory of yesterday's work in their uneven edges. Smoke rises slowly from a cooking fire where only a small meal can be prepared. Supplies are already being counted more carefully than before. Hunger has begun to change the rhythm of the settlement. At first, the arrival in this new land carried a sense of possibility. Some settlers believed they would quickly discover valuable resources. Others imagined trade routes forming easily along the riverbanks. But the soil has not yet been cleared for planting, and the forest does not yield food as quickly as expected. Work can no longer wait. John Smith, one of the colony's leaders during these early months, understood this more quickly than many others. He observed that survival depends not on status or expectation, but on effort shared across the settlement. So he introduced a rule that became well known among the settlers. Those who did not work will not eat. The rule was simple. It did not require long explanation, and it changed the colony almost at once. Men who had once expected to supervise rather than build now carried timber across muddy ground. Others helped dig shallow wells or repair damaged walls along the palisade. Even small tasks became important when every hour of daylight shaped the colony's chances of lasting through the season. Nearby, Thomas the carpenter kneels beside a section of fence that has begun leaning slightly where the soil remains soft. He pressed his shoulders gently against one post while adjusting the angle of another with a wooden mallet. Each strike produces a steady sound that travels along the length of the wall like a quiet signal, passing from one worker to the next. Repairing a fence may seem like a small task, but here, small tasks hold large consequences. A stronger wall protects food stores, a straighter post supports a roof beam, a tighter joint keeps wind from carrying rain into sleeping spaces when storms arrive later in the year. Work spreads across the settlement in careful patterns, the way a craftsman strengthens a structure one piece at a time until the whole begins to hold together. Yet even with this effort, the settlers cannot depend only on their own labor. The surrounding region is already home to neighboring communities who understand the land far better than the newcomers do. These belong to a wider network often called the Powhatan Confederacy, whose towns extend along rivers and forest paths unfamiliar to English eyes. Trade begins quietly. At first, it is cautious. Corn appears in exchange for tools. Food travels across short distances carried by hands that watch carefully for signs of trust or hesitation. These exchanges are not formal agreements written on paper. They are moments of observation, repeat again and again until patterns begin to form. For the settlers, corn became something more than food. It provides instruction. It teaches which seasons matter most. It teaches which fields can be planted successfully. It teaches how to survive in this place depends on listening as much as building. It is sometimes said, with gentle recognition rather than embarrassment, that corn taught lessons faster than speeches ever could. Thomas pauses in his work long enough to look toward the riverbank where another group is gathered near a canoe pulled halfway onto the shore. The exchange taking place there is quiet, but important. A small basket passes from one set of hands to another. No announcement marks the moment, yet everyone understands what it means. The food has arrived. Inside the palisade, movement becomes quicker. Someone begins preparing a cooking pot. Another carries a bundle of firewood toward the center of the settlement. Even those who remain silent while working nearby listen carefully for news of what has been brought. Hunger changes attention. It sharpens the meaning of ordinary objects. A single ear of corn now carries the promise of another day's strength. Still, cooperation remains fragile. Not every exchange unfolds easily. Misunderstandings appear from time to time, shaped by differences in language, expectations, and memory of earlier encounters. Trust grows slowly in places where survival depends on decisions made quickly. Thomas lifts his mallet again and strikes the fence post once more. The sound echoes briefly across the yard before fading into the steady movement of work continuing on all sides. Each repair strengthens more than wood. It strengthens the habit of staying. Nearby, a group of settlers begins clearing a narrow strip of ground where planting may soon become possible. Their movements are slower than those of experienced farmers, yet they continue without pause. Practice grows through repetition, even when the first attempts feel uncertain. The rule introduced earlier still shapes the morning. Learn first, food afterward. It is not a harsh command. It is a reminder that survival belongs to everyone together. Above the palisade wall, the river reflects the changing light of late morning. Boats rock gently where they're tied along the bank. Beyond them stretch a landscape that continues offering both uncertainty and possibility in equal measure. Soon, the settlement will face another challenge that cannot be solved by fences or trade alone. It will need households strong enough to last through winter. And before long, new arrivals will begin stepping ashore, whose presence will quietly reshape how families form in this unfamiliar place. The shoreline looks different when ships arrive carrying not tools, but people whose presence will change the settlement in quieter ways. By now, the palisade walls stand more firmly than before. Paths between the houses are easier to follow. Gardens have begun appearing in narrow strips cleared of soil beside doorways. The settlement still feels uncertain, yet it no longer feels temporary. It is ready for something new. Across the river's surface, another vessel approaches slowly, its sails lowered as it drifts toward the landing place. The wooden hull moves gently against the current, guided by careful hands that understand how narrow this stretch of water can feel after a long crossing. Word spreads quickly along the shoreline. New arrivals are coming. Among them is Margaret. She stands near the edge of the deck as the boat settles against the bank. Her journey has taken longer than expected, and the river air feels different from the sea wind she has grown used to over recent weeks. It carries warmth and the scent of wet soil at the same time, unfamiliar, but not unfriendly. When she steps onto the shore, the settlement seems both smaller and larger than she imagined, smaller in its buildings, larger in its expectations. Margaret is not arriving alone by accident. Her journey is part of a plan shaped months earlier by the same investors who first supported the colony across the ocean. They had begun to understand that a settlement made mostly of men could not easily become stable. Work crews could build walls and plant fields, but household requirements require something more balanced to endure. So they encouraged women to travel to the colony as well. Passage across the ocean was expensive, and few families could afford it easily. To solve this, arrangements were sometimes made in which the cost of travel would later be repaid using tobacco grown in the colony itself. In this way, a plant already shaping the economy began shaping families as well. Romance in such moments occasionally arrived packed beside trade goods. Margaret carries little with her as she steps onto the bank. A small bundle of clothing rests over one arm. The rest of what she brings cannot be carried so easily. It includes expectation, uncertainty, and the quiet knowledge that her presence will help determine whether the settlement becomes something lasting or something temporary. Nearby, several settlers paused their work as the new arrivals gathered near the landing place. Their expressions are careful rather than hurried. They understand that these meetings matter. A colony without household cannot easily survive winter. A settlement without families cannot easily become a community. Margaret looks toward the palisade as she begins walking inland. Inside the enclosure, narrow paths connect doorways where smoke rises from cooking fires prepared earlier in the morning. Gardens stretch beside the walls, their soil newly turned and still dark from recent watering. The settlement does not yet resemble a town, but it no longer resembles a camp. It resembles a beginning. Women arriving in Jamestown during these years often carried choices that shaped the colony's future in ways both visible and quiet. Some entered marriages quickly after arrival. Others waited longer, learning the rhythms of the settlement before deciding where they might belong. Each decision helped transform the colony from a place of temporary labor into something closer to shared life. Margaret pauses beside a doorway where a clay pot rests near the entrance. A neighbor greeted her gently and offered water drawn earlier that morning. The gesture is simple, yet it marks the beginning of something important. Hospitality here does not depend on comfort, it depends on recognition. Thomas the carpenter watches from a short distance away. He has seen the settlement change slowly over the past months. Walls have grown straighter, roofs have become stronger, fields have begun to stretch farther from the palisade. Now another change is beginning, one that cannot be measured in timber or soil. Households are forming. Marriage in Jamestown was rarely only about companionship. It was about cooperation, protection, and the sharing of labor across seasons that could not be faced alone. A household meant someone to help store grain before winter arrived, someone to maintain clothing during colder months, someone to share decisions when supplies run low. It meant continuity. Margaret steps further along the path, passing gardens where young plants have only recently begun to take root. A child follows at a short distance, watching the newcomers with quiet curiosity before returning to the doorway where a cooking pot continues to warm over a small fire. The settlement grows quieter for a moment as everyone adjusts to the change. New voices join old ones. New footsteps cross familiar paths. New expectations settle into place like birds choosing branches along a riverbank at dusk, each one finding space without pushing the others aside. Marriage arrangements begin slowly after arrival. Introductions are made through neighbors. Conversations unfold beside cooking fires. Agreements take shape through practical understanding rather than ceremony alone. In this place, forming a household means forming protection against uncertainty. Margaret pauses once more before turning toward the doorway where she will stay for the night. Behind her, the river continues moving steadily past the settlement walls. Boats shift gently where they're tied along the shore. Beyond them stretch a landscape already preparing to shape the colony's future in another unexpected way. Soon, a single crop will begin changing how land is used, how labor is organized, and how the settlement itself understands its purpose. The river still moves beside the settlement as steady as before, yet something new has begun to change the land along its edges. At first, the change is easy to miss. It appears only as narrow rows cut carefully cleared into soil just beyond the palisade. The ground there has been turned more deeply than before, shaped into long lines that stretch across small fields where trees once stood. The rows look modest from a distance, but they carry expectations larger than anyone yet fully understand. These are tobacco beds. Thomas kneels beside one of them in the early morning light. He pressed his fingers gently into the soil, testing its softness before placing another small plant into position. The leaves are still young, their edges pale and flexible. They do not yet resemble the tall, broad plants they will become by the end of the season. Even so, each one has already begun reshaping the colony. Not long after Jamestown's earliest struggles, settlers discovered that a particular variety of tobacco grown successfully by John Rolfe could be traded across the Atlantic with surprising demand. Buyers in England preferred its milder flavor, and shipments soon began leaving the colony more regularly than before. A plant that once grew quietly in scattered patches began appearing everywhere. Fields expanded, fences moved outward, labor followed the leaves. Thomas straightens one row before moving to the next. He leaves space between each plant wide enough for sunlight to reach the lower leaves later in the season. The pattern must be careful. If the plants grow too close together, they weaken one another. If they grow too far apart, the field wastes precious ground. Spacing becomes a kind of map. Across the settlement, other fields begin following the same pattern. This careful arrangement changes more than agriculture. It changes how people measure time. Tobacco requires attention across many months, from planting to drying to packing for shipment. Work must be planned not only for today's survival, but for next season's harvest as well. Tiny leaves begin quietly rearranging very large plans. As tobacco spreads outward from the settlement, it brings new kinds of workers with it. Some of these workers arrive under agreements that promise several years of labor in exchange for passage across the ocean. They are known as identified servants, though their lives within the colony vary widely depending on the conditions they encounter after arrival. Many hope that once their years of service are completed, they will receive their own land. Others arrive later under different circumstances. In the year 1619, a group of Africans reached the Virginia colony after a difficult journey shaped by forces beyond their control. Their presence marked the beginning of changes that would gradually alter how labor was organized across the region in the years that followed. At first, their status did not yet resemble the rigid systems that would appear later, but the direction of change had already begun. Fields continued to expand, ships continued to arrive, labor continued to shift. Thomas pauses for a moment and looks across the rows stretching toward the riverbank. The pattern now extends farther than he expected when the first plants were placed into the soil. What began as an experiment has become a habit. Nearby, bundles of leaves harvested earlier in the season hang beneath a simple wooden shelter where they can dry slowly in moving air. The scent drifting from them is sharp, but not unpleasant. It settles into clothing, tools, and even the wood of nearby buildings, marking the settlement with a smell that travelers begin recovering from a distance. The plant has become part of the colony's identity. Trade grows more regular. Ships that once arrived uncertainly now return with clearer expectations. Tobacco leaves packed carefully into barrels begin traveling back across the ocean in larger numbers each year. In return, tools, clothing, and supplies settlement arrive that allows it to continue expanding beyond its first fragile boundaries. The rhythm of work changes again. Fields require clearing farther from the palisade. Paths stretch outward into new ground. Neighbors who once worked side by side within the enclosure now travel longer distances between houses as farms spread along the river's edge. The colony begins to resemble something larger than a single settlement. Thomas lifts another plant and presses soil around its roots with both hands. He has learned how much attention each leaf requires before it reaches maturity. Too much rain can damage it. Too little sunlight can weaken it. Insects must be watched carefully. Leaves must be turned at the right time during drying. The work is patient, yet its effects travel far beyond the field itself. As tobacco grows, settlers begin choosing representatives who can speak together about shared concerns across the colony. Meetings take shape in which decisions are discussed collectively, rather than separately. These gatherings do not yet resemble large assemblies, but they mark the beginning of something new. The settlement is learning how to speak for itself. Above the fields, the sky opens wide across the river valley. Clouds move slowly from one horizon to the other, their shadows passing over the rows of plants below. From a distance, the fields begin to resemble constellations arranged carefully across the earth, each leaf occupying its place within a pattern larger than any single worker can see at once. The colony is no longer only surviving, it is organizing. And before long, settlers will gather to choose voices who can represent them together, shaping decisions that reach beyond individual fields toward the future of the settlement itself. Evening settles slowly along the river once more. The air feels quieter now than it did in the first uncertain days after the ships arrived. Paths between houses are clearer. Gardens stretch farther from doorways. Fields of tobacco extend beyond the palisade, where trees once stood unbroken. The settlement still feels young, but it no longer feels temporary. Something else has begun to grow here as well. Not crops, not houses, a habit of speaking together. As the sun lowers toward the horizon, settlers begin gathering near one of the larger wooden buildings inside the enclosure. The structure is simple, built from timber, shaped only as much as necessary to keep out wind and rain. Yet tonight, it carries a different purpose from storage or shelter. Inside, voices are preparing to meet. In the year 1619, representatives chose from several settlements in the Virginia colony gathered for what would become one of the earliest assemblies of its kind in English North America. Their task was not to create a kingdom or declare independence. It was something quieter. They came to discuss how the colony should be governed together. Margaret watches the gathering from a short distance away. She stands near the edge of the path where the last light of evening rests briefly on the tops of the palisade posts. A lantern hangs beside a nearby doorway. Its flame moves gently whenever someone passes. The glow spreads across the packed earth in soft circles, marking each step taken toward the meeting place. Men enter slowly, not all at once. Some arrive carrying tools they have only just set aside. Others pause outside the doorway before stepping in, as though adjusting to the idea that their voices will soon carry weight beyond their own household. No formal uniforms distinguish them. They look much like they did earlier in the day while working in fields or repairing roofs. Yet the purpose of the evening changes how they move. Inside the building, benches have been arranged facing one another across a narrow open space. This arrangement allows each speaker to be seen and heard without anyone standing above the rest for long. Conversation here is meant to travel between neighbors rather than descend from authority. The habit is familiar in another way. Long ago, in a distant Greek city, men once reclined on couches, arranged in similar patterns while sharing wine and conversation. There, they learned how ideas could move sideways between companions rather than downward from teachers. Here, Along the riverbank of a young colony, something related begins again in a different form. Voices begin quietly. One speaker describes the need for clearer settlement rules about planting land near the. Another suggests ways to organize trade so supplies can be shared more evenly between households. A third raises questions about relations with neighboring communities whose knowledge of the region continues to shape survival in ways the settlers cannot ignore. No single voice remains at the center for long. Instead, conversation shifts gently from one speaker to another, carried forward by listening as much as by speaking. Decisions grow slowly in such spaces. They do not appear all at once. They take shape the way paths appear between houses after many footsteps have passed in the same direction. Outside the doorway, Margaret watches the lantern light move. She cannot hear every word spoken inside the building, yet she understands what the gathering represents. The colony is no longer only reacting to weather, hunger, or distance from home. It is beginning to choose how it wishes to continue. Nearby, someone adjusts the wick of another lantern hanging beside a fence post. The flame brightens briefly before settling again. Light spreads across the yard, where children pass between doorways carrying small bundles of kindling for evening fires. Voices drift across the settlement in low conversation as household preparations for the night. Life continues while decisions are made. Earlier years in Jamestown had relied heavily on guidance sent across the ocean from investors and officials who had never walked these paths themselves. Now, settlers are beginning to shape rules closer to the ground beneath their feet. Representation does not solve every difficulty. It does not remove uncertainty from the seasons ahead, but it changes how uncertainty is faced. Margaret turns slightly as another figure approaches the edge of the yard. For a moment she thought it was Thomas returning from the fields, but instead it was a messenger carrying news from farther along the river. Exchanges with neighboring communities continue to shape the colony's future as well. Among the most remembered figures in these encounters is a young woman known as Pocahontas, whose presence in earlier years helped create moments of communication between English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. Her story is often told in simplified ways, yet in its quieter form, it reflects the careful work of diplomacy carried across languages, customs, and expectations that did not easily align. Her journey later took her across the ocean to England, where she was presented as a sign that cooperation between worlds might be possible, even if the reality remains more complicated than appearances suggested. Inside the meeting house, voices begin to settle. Some agreements have been reached, others will need further discussion in days ahead, yet the act of gathering itself has already changed something important. A settlement that once struggled simply to remain standing has begun learning how to speak with its own voice. Margaret lifts her eyes toward the river one last time before turning toward her doorway. Lantern light reflects softly across the surface of the water, moving in narrow bands that shift with the current. Night insects begin their steady rhythm in the reeds beyond the palisade. The sounds are quiet enough that they almost disappear into the darkness. If you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes of these early gatherings in the ways communities continue learning how to live together, share decisions, and shape their futures side by side. And so, as the lanterns dim and the river continues its patient movement beside the settlement, the long day of wandering through distant villages, shaded courtyards, lamplit rooms, and uncertain shorelines begins to come gently to rest. And so, we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, and the small, brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watching.